Welcome to OECD Podcast, where policy meets people. You're listening to our special World in Emotion series, highlighting the topics and speakers of the OECD Forum 2019, starting May 20th in Paris.
Hello, I'm Clara Young, and I'm talking with Anna Minton, who's a writer, journalist, and reader in architecture at the University of East London. She's the author of Big Capital, Who is London For? And before that, Ground Control, Fear and Happiness in the 21st Century City. So very nice to meet you, Anna.
Nice to meet you.
I think that most people would agree that having a home, or at the very least a decent place to live, is a basic human right. And yet, in many major cities in OECD countries, people are finding it harder and harder to rent or buy a home. And think about this. A little over 50% of the world's population now live in cities, and that percentage is growing. So how can we house everyone? Anna, I know the situation with affordable and social housing in London is very complex. Can you tell us what's happening here in a nutshell?
Well, you're right. It's extremely complex, and I almost think it's been deliberately designed that way. Since housing in the UK has been so totally financialised, actually it's become at the same time almost impossible to understand, and that is a byproduct of the privatisation of housing. So 40 years ago, before housing was seen purely as a commodity, which is what it is today, actually it was quite easy to understand housing. You had owner occupation, you had council housing,
which is the social housing,
which is what we call social housing today, and you had private rented housing, and it was easy to understand. But what we've started to see in the last 15 years or so, perhaps even longer, is actually this incredible confusion around social housing and so-called affordable housing, which to my mind is a deliberate obscuring of the issue, because nowadays the government really doesn't provide barely any social housing at all. And in fact, this sector has been decimated mainly through the right to buy, the sell-off of council homes, which saw the sale of actually 2 million council homes. Social housing.
This happened in the 90s, in the early 90s, right?
From the 1980s.
Right.
It was Margaret Thatcher's flagship policy. It was introduced in the early 80s, and it continues in England to this day. During this period, council housing got renamed social housing, and as the stock dwindled, we started to see the emergence of this part of the market called affordable housing. Now, this has changed under every government, what affordable housing actually is, but when politicians talk to you about affordable housing, actually the Conservative government in 2010 redefined affordable housing to mean up to 80% of market rent or market value.
So not very affordable
at
all. With
London prices, with prices in many British cities, prices across the southeast of England, that's far from affordable for the vast majority of people. At the same time, the government barely talks about social housing. It doesn't build social housing. So it becomes very, very confusing. And I'd say deliberately confusing. Then affordable housing is split into these further subsectors of homes to part rent, part buy, shared ownership, all of these so-called products. Housing is now sort of subdivided into a whole range of financial products, and it becomes impossible to understand. Essentially, we as a country, we build hardly any social housing at all compared to what we used to, and that is the single biggest contributor to our housing crisis. It's a pincer movement. We've decimated social housing, but at the same time we've had this post-2008 effect on the market as well, and we've also had this influx of huge amounts of global capital into our housing market here in London, really fueling housing land prices, especially in the capital.
On top of the rising prices of rent, which according to the 2017 Mayor's Report, Housing in London went up 38% between 2005 and 2016. The other part of the pincer movement is that the average individual earnings have only gone up 21%. So you have wage stagnation. Now, I want to ask, why have private rents gone up so much? Where is the regulation of that?
Exactly. You may well ask. I mean, regulation became a dirty word from 2010. The government famously said they wanted to see a bonfire of regulation. The private rented sector isn't regulated. The market isn't regulated.
Okay, so that would be perhaps where to start.
Well, yes,
in
there is
untangling this mess.
Well, there is a discussion being had. The current Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, is looking into rent controls, but it's a very contentious issue. And if they do even introduce some rent controls, I suspect they will be on a very small scale.
Now, if I understand correctly, because there is very little social housing, I assume that the slack is supposed to be taken up by these private rentals. And what's happening is that people are being forced to pay very high rents.
That's right. It's not correct to say there is very little social housing compared, say, to Southern European countries, which haven't had this history and tradition of state subsidised housing. Given that we started off with really quite a lot, there does remain over a fifth of our housing is social housing, but compared to what it was, it's far, far less. And now what we've seen, as the social housing stock has been shrunk, people who were in social housing now live in private rented accommodation, and that's paid for by the housing benefit system. But housing benefit doesn't cover all of those spiralling rents, so people are constantly evicted, which creates a humanitarian crisis in its turn.
Right. I have a figure here that the housing benefit amount of housing benefit paid to private landlords doubled from £4.6 billion in 2006 to £9.3 billion in 2016. So,
and it will
a
be
catastrophe.
Considerably more than that as, now. And actually what's happened, in a bid to get that housing benefit bill down, the government said, we're going to pay out less housing benefit and that will bring the bill down. But it hasn't, because housing and land prices have gone up, rents have gone up. You can't get housing to rent below a certain price. So it just means that tenants are in this constant cycle of not being able to afford it and being kicked out of their homes, being moved on to cheaper places.
More than 3 times as many people now live on the street than before the financial crisis.
That's right. It's very, very visible.
We did an interview with Alexander Zeldin, who is a playwright. And in his play, Love, he shows a family who had been kicked out of a private rental because they couldn't pay, and they were put in temporary shelter. So this is something that is happening to many, many people.
Absolutely. And when we talk about temporary accommodation, actually that's a huge sector. When you say people living on the street, that's actually people literally sleeping rough on the street. And those figures have more than doubled, literally sleeping outside. Those figures are probably much more than doubled now since 2010. But the numbers in temporary accommodation, which is another way of classifying homelessness as well. This is also part of the confusion, but the numbers in temporary accommodation have also soared, and that is particularly families.
Right. In your latest book, you argue that these specific circumstances in the history of London housing, which we've been talking about, has combined with an influx of global capital into the city, and this is pushing prices up even further. Can you go into this?
Yeah. So the way I describe it in the book, I say, well, my view is that trickle-down economics really hasn't worked. Trickle-down being the idea that lots of wealth comes into an area, let's say all this global capital comes into the city, and it trickles down to benefit the poorest parts which need it the most. And we can see all around us that it doesn't work. But actually we do have a type of trickle-down which is very much in evidence. But instead of benefiting poorer communities, it displaces them. And the way it does that is actually by raising land and property prices and rents so that those original communities can no longer afford to live there and they are pushed out. So you can see the trickle down of land and property prices and displacement through London, to the point where actually many families now can no longer afford to live in London at all, and they may move to South Coast towns, Margate, Hastings, Bristol, and again that process will happen in those areas as well.
These billionaires and outside investors, are they buying to let or to rent as absentee landlords, or are they buying second homes?
Yeah, I think it's a mixture, actually. It's quite hard to get stats. But if you are a billionaire, oligarch type, you may well not be present, in your fifth home. You're living that kind of transatlantic type of lifestyle. You may only come for a few weeks a year. So actually it would have the same sort of effect.
In that same mayor's report that I mentioned earlier, it says that only 1.3% of homes in London are second homes, not specifying belonging to whom, but that second homes comprise actually quite a small percentage of the homes in London.
Yeah, I mean, I think the phenomenon of leaving homes empty just to see the prices rise is much larger than the buying multiple homes. And we know that a lot of those properties aren't lived in, but equally a lot will be Airbnb. It's just using property in a very different way.
Local housing authorities and councils, they say they're impoverished and they can't do anything about that. But then at the same time, you're also saying that the value of land has been going up and up and up for all these different reasons that we discussed. Now, is there no way for the City of London to capture any of that land value?
Oh, I mean, there absolutely could be if there was a different ideological approach to housing. Of course there is. If we had a different approach to public land, we could do things very, very differently. I mean, one of the examples I always give is, as far as I know, the municipal authority in Zurich has said that all public land in the city needs to be used for joint ventures with housing associations. Now, Transport for London, public body in London, has said that all its public land needs to be used for joint ventures with private developers, private house builders. So that is such a different approach.
We've looked at in the OECD what sort of land use governance in other cities, and Amsterdam was one city that the OECD has looked at, and the city has made money off the rising value of its land with something called a ground lease system, where the city leases out the land it owns in return for rent. Is that an idea that London could borrow?
I mean, absolutely it is, but once again, there would need to be the political will to look for those sorts of solutions which are rooted in housing as a public good, rather than actually wanting land prices to rise and believing that keeping the market going, inflated, and trying to get as many people into home ownership as possible is the way forward.
So there's a lack of public will to make housing affordable?
Alternative political perspectives would put forward those sorts of solutions, saying actually the market is restricted. Free the market, we'll see more housing, we'll see prices coming down. That's argued very, very often. I think that would make the situation even worse.
And there is no mechanism for a public review of housing policy in London? A process that opens it up, makes it more transparent, which involves all the different interested parties. Again, I go back to...
we've had many commissions and reviews into housing over the years. The previous Labour government did a quite important review by the economist Kate Barker into housing, which looked at land value tax, it looked at social housing. It came out with some very, very good recommendations which were not implemented. And my view on that is that simply the house builders in this country have a stranglehold over the government. So that work has been done A lot of people know what needs to be done, but it just isn't done.
So what can be done about that? What can be done about this stranglehold?
Well, it needs to be broken. The system isn't working for anybody, but there are so many vested interests, and these players are connected with policy and government.
What about housing activism?
Housing activism is making a difference, especially around the demolition of housing estates. I think that really has taken off, and we've seen some significant successes which have led into some significant legal successes as well. I don't think we're anywhere near the situation where they've been in Spain, where that housing activist movement became so strong. We've got nothing really like that at all. Housing activism is behind some successes, but it certainly hasn't been able to make the sort of dent in the tide that we need. That said, the movement towards more secure tenancies, towards rent controls, towards better conditions for tenants, that is as a result of successful housing activism.
Lots of food for thought, Anna, and thanks for speaking with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to OECD Podcasts. I'm Clara Young. For more OECD information on housing, have a look at the governance of land use in OECD countries. And of course, Anna Minton's latest book is Big Capital, Who is London For? Give it a read.
Thank you for listening to OECD Podcasts. You can learn more on this topic at the 2019 OECD Forum World in Emotion, taking place May 20th and 21st. To listen to more OECD podcasts, you can find us on Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcasts, and SoundCloud.com/OECD.